I wanted to thank Serena and Ms. Ju for their hospitality and also for inviting me to come here and talk to you on a subject which I confess not to be an expert on. That's to say, I'm interested in the Chinese book and its social history, but getting involved into the question of paper making as well as print making has been something of a very sort of steep learning curve. And I can see with the history of paper making in particular, it's something that can easily take at least one lifetime, if not two lifetimes, particularly if you want to bring China into the story. A second reason for being happy to be here, and as well as is that it seems to me that the people like myself who have focused on Chinese history in the last 50 or 60 years have, in their efforts to try to bring China into global history or Western history, have unfortunately forgotten that there is a large landmass between China and Europe. And that when it comes to, for example, studying the history of the transmission of paper or the transmission of printing technology from China westward, the history of the Middle East is absolutely crucial to this story. In fact, I think one of the points that I hope you come away from my talk today is that it is the absence of the story or the absence of evidence in the Middle East that is perhaps the most compelling reason for us, at least at present, to doubt that Chinese printing technology, be that movable type or woodblock printing, actually ever left western reaches of Asia to reach Mr. Gutenberg or his people with similar interest in the early modern West. Now, with the history of paper making technology, I have here on this map over here. Here is China here, and just here's Dongguan here, and over here is Xi'an. And we can say that from the past 30, 40 years of archaeological research in China, it's now clear that paper making was certainly practiced in many parts of central and northern China by roughly 100 BC. That's to say 200 years before the traditional date that you would have found in most textbooks about the history of Chinese or anywhere, the production of paper as recently as 30 years ago. Traditionally, it was associated, according to the Chinese text, to a discovery by a eunuch at the court for the emperor. But now we realize that long before that, originally perhaps for wrapping things rather than for writing itself, the Chinese had invented various forms of paper. Now, the technology that would be used, regardless of whether it was to be made with hemp or some sort of fiber, some form of linen perhaps, or mulberry bark, or perhaps rags, was essentially going to be very similar. And here are 6 different stages that you can see in what goes into the Chinese production of paper, from some form of fiber plant into boiling it up to be macerated, and then here being put on a mold, and here being put to dry initially to get some of the water, reducing the water in the actual sheets of paper. And then here, effectively, we have a hothouse, a wall with the walls that people put individual sheets on. Now, this Chinese in the Tang Dynasty, by the Tang Dynasty at the latest, would have had water mills with effectively some form of a pounder and a mace helping to make the pulp fiber into much finer paper. And here we have the oldest print dating from 1568 of how Westerners did it. And once again, we see the importance of the mold in creating the form of the sheet. And that would be crucial throughout Eurasia, effectively in the size of individual sheets, because unless you had some form of pulleys, which were often rather complicated for operations that were often very, very small scale businesses, effectively it was a limit to the size you could have of any individual sheets of paper being made. Now I have here, going back to show you dates, which I hope you can see from this map here of Eurasia. I should say one of the delights in preparing for this lecture was the chance to become introduced to some excellent scholarship that's been done on paper making and paper making technology on the Middle East by Jonathan Bloom and Helen Loveday, who I believe was, at least for a time, associated with the British Library or the British Museum. And essentially, their research is absolutely first-rate, and if you are interested in pursuing the topic, for you to look at those books. This shows how effectively, by the time you get to 650, you're in Dunhuang, and then you have the technology moving out quickly to Samarkand. And by 751, supposedly, there are Chinese artisans who are captured from an army that's been defeated by the Muslim invasion of Western Asia, and they're taken off, believe it or not, to Baghdad, where effectively they introduced the technology. And by 794, they're actually making it in large numbers in Baghdad, and eventually from there on, by and large, the story is to go farther and farther west, with, of course, the Persian coming in slightly later to the story, but they are crucial in basically setting up a bureaucratic operation which requires large amounts of it. Now, when it came to the Middle East, there was some resistance initially because of the popularity and the history of papyrus. But perhaps surprisingly, given the opposition that would later be met to the introduction of printing technology, when, for example, in 1485, the Ottoman Empire banned the introduction of the printing press, paper technology absolutely had no resistance from the state or from the Islamic religion. The only thing that was later resisted by certain users of paper in the Middle East was from Western paper that entered from the 14th century on with watermarks, and certain purveyors of stationery in the Middle East thought this perhaps was sacrilegious because it introduced some form of representation that the Muslim religion did not like. But what is perhaps the most striking part of the story, in a sense, is that while it took arguably something like 800 years to go from, let's say, Loyang off to Samarkand, by the time we get to roughly the 11th century, or maybe even the late 10th century, there is evidence of paper actually being used, and some would say perhaps even made in Spain, so that the Islamic world was very receptive to its use for all sorts of purposes. Now, if we turn then quickly, and this will be a very, very quick rush through the history of printing technology, we essentially have two types of printing technology. One would be woodblock, and the other one would be movable type. And there is no clear textual or archaeological record, such as we have with paper, of any pre-Gutenberg transmission beyond Central Asia for either technology. Woodblock from 700, or movable type invented in China from 1040. Now, the Chinese adopted mainly the first of these, that's to say woodblock, as their principal form of woodblock printing, simply because it's commonly thought the sheer number of Chinese characters made it far more economical and efficient just to have the blocks rather than the actual so-called fonts of wooden or or ceramic or later metal type that you would have in the West. And so between roughly 1300s and 1400s in the West, you had both types in print, both types in use, sorry, the woodblock as well as the movable type. And then from 1500 on, we begin to see East Asian, the Chinese, and the European, which both had both types, diverge, and different technology sets emerge. Technology sets meaning that in addition to the type of technology that you would do, the machine, let's say, of the printing press, you would have a different type of oil, you would have a different type of paper and a different type of ink. The Chinese being a water-based and the European one being an oil-based. The printing press itself was something that the Chinese, did not have. This is, if you wish to see the quality of the Chinese woodblock print from the late 10th century. Here is basically the woodblock at the time when Gutenberg went and invented his movable type. This was the alternative technology, and you can see how there was no really choice in quality of the precision that could be possible with Chinese carving methods. The fineness, I can't blow it up unfortunately on this, but this is extraordinarily delicate carving in this print which survives in a Japanese temple, I think it's 984 date. Now, just show here, this here is a famous 1604 print of an Antwerp print shop. And I mention this because some people have ever since really the middle of the 16th century in the West speculated, did Chinese technology ever get for woodblock printing or for movable type printing ever get to the West? Now, crucially here, look, this Archimedean screw is essential to the working of the printing press. And as far as we know, that did not get to East Asia until the late 16th century for use in silver mines in southern Japan. And for China, the earliest record we have, textual record, is the 19th century. So the possibility of that sort of machine coming westward is basically zero. The farthest westward archaeological finds that we have, this is like, oh, it's not here, sorry. This is an image of the oldest imprint in the whole world with movable type. It dates from roughly 1160 and was discovered in China relatively recently, the end of the 20th century, in the Buddhist pagoda that had collapsed. Now, this particular form of printing, those of you who sitting even in the front are going to be going like this, what? I can't see it, it's not clear. And the reason is because this oldest book, printed book, movable type printed book in the world is actually in the Tangut language, not in Chinese. And there is at least 10 other such texts or books that have been found out in Central Asia, in the former Xisha state, which we know had adopted Chinese technology for printing. As for places west, this form of technology is not found. The so-called type, the movable type itself, examples of it were found in Western Asia by Pelio around 100 years ago, and farther west evidence of such type, or as well as this type of imprint, has never been found. If we slightly change the question, did Chinese paper-making technology ever get to the West? And we simply ask three questions. When did Westerners first learn of Chinese printing or get Chinese books? When did Europeans first learn of the priority of Chinese printing? And when did Europeans first learn of Chinese printing technology? We find that the earliest records of printing of any sort in China come from essentially paper money, but no one in the West, when they went there in the medieval times, was interested in anything about the technology. They were just interested in the fact that Chinese could, quote unquote, make money. And that was the mystery, rather than the technology. And secondly, the Europeans first got a Chinese book in 1514. The Pope was presented it by the King of Portugal as evidence of his recent expeditions around the world, and the plan was to send a rhinoceros to the Vatican. And when the rhinoceros died on the way back, they decided, well, if we can't get a rhinoceros, we better send that book. And of course, no one could read it. It was a piece of exotica, and the fact that, quote unquote, it was a book, the fact that, so to speak, way, someone was printing books was like having a piece of Mars come to the earth. How were those people actually ever making those books? The idea that it was woodblock printing didn't cross their mind at all, and it really would only be in the 18th century that Westerners finally learned from the Jesuits, this is Du Halde in his book about China, that the Chinese had invented a form of movable type, not the printing press, which had become a secondary form of book production in a primarily woodblock culture. So if we look away from the Chinese textual record or look for material evidence, some scholars have said, well, actually there are similarities in the way certain things are done for framing it, or perhaps some form of carving shows woodblock print influence, but in fact, those are probably independent solutions to common problems. And so we end up with a serious lack of evidence, particularly from the Middle East, about the history of printing or printing technology coming from China. And please remember that in 1485, that Ottoman Empire ban was directed not against Chinese books or Chinese printing technology, but European. So it was as if they didn't know in the Middle East that, quote unquote, farther east, there was a Chinese printing tradition. There was no, so to speak, Portuguese who dropped off on the way back and showed them that book that was destined for the Vatican. Now, perhaps a way in which perhaps to explain it is to take that very famous bestseller of the early 17th century, Matteo Ricci's books, which have been called the Journal of Matteo Ricci's Adventures in China, what would be printed 11 editions in 6 European languages would come out in Europe and even in South America, where people would learn about printing and the Chinese methods, but no such description appeared in the Middle East at the time, even though actually a Persian visiting Rome at the time got hold of Matteo Ricci's book, brought it back to the Middle East, and this is in around 1650. And a copy of that translation, one copy survives in the Middle East, or actually today in Calcutta. Just one copy, because of course it could not be printed. And how much evidence in the Middle East of Chinese printing, how much information there was about China itself from that Jesuit expedition is unclear at present, but it would appear, since only one copy had survived in a place where printing was not possible, that we have an absence of knowledge as well as an absence of evidence. Now, that would seem to be the sole end of the story until not long ago I came across this image. This here. This essentially is an amulet. Now, amulets were printed, we know, in the Middle East from some form of seal in Arabic with prayers on it for travelers or for people trying to gain protection of Allah or some sort of god. And essentially this was unearthed not so long ago in Spain. And so as far as I know, the only evidence we have of pre-Gutenberg printing objects that actually, with text, survive in Europe is, believe it or not, a prayer to Allah in Arabic in pre-Iberian, in the Iberian Peninsula before the takeover by the Christian forces. And so if we ought to find a quote-unquote history of westward transmission of technology, Chinese technology westward, it would have to be something that Gutenberg would not have used. It would have been woodblock printing. And secondly, it would involve very much the introduction of Islam to Europe. But of course, as we know, that was not ultimately successful. And so, having rushed through this talk very quickly, I'm happy to answer any questions that you have later on. Okay.